In the last few days, something has changed inside my house. But it wasn't anything a camera could record. The air became drier, harsher, almost cutting, as if I were breathing invisible dust. The floorboards creak at times that don't match any of my movements, and sometimes, in the silence, I hear a muffled sound, like hooves stepping on loose earth, far away, yet within the walls. I found dark dust accumulated in the corners, even after cleaning. And the most unsettling thing, I heard my name spoken in Daniel's exact voice, a voice that should no longer exist. Today, at 4:44 a.m., I woke up to the clear sound of heavy footsteps. Footsteps that weren't human. They sounded like hooves dragging across the hallway floor. Slow, calculated, as if something were searching for the right door. When I turned on the light, there was no sign of footprints, only a trail of darker dust, like desert sand, forming a semicircle in front of my bedroom door. But what truly took my breath away was the living room mirror. Behind my reflection, there were hoof marks on the floor. Marks that didn't exist in the real world. At first, I thought it was just ordinary dirt. Dust accumulating in the corners, particles suspended in the air when the morning light streamed through the window. But this dust, it wasn't normal dust. It had a strange color, a darkened brown, almost reddish in some spots, as if it came from a place where the sun had scorched the earth for centuries. I would clean at night, and in the morning it would be there again, thicker, more spread out, as if it had been carried by the wind. Except there was no wind inside my house. The smell also changed. The air took on a dry odor, similar to an environment that had been closed off for decades, but mixed with something mineral, earthy, like when you break an ancient stone in half. The feeling inside the rooms became stuffy, heavy. Even my breathing seemed shorter. It was as if the oxygen was being drained, slowly replaced by a silent heat that came from no human source. The sand began to appear in impossible places. Above the doorframe, between the keys of my computer, inside drawers I was sure I hadn't opened in weeks. What bothered me most wasn't the physical presence of the dust, but rather what it represented. The entire house seemed to be taken over by something that didn't come from the natural world. It was as if each grain was a particle from somewhere very distant, a place I shouldn't have access to. The texture of this dust was too fine, almost alive. It slipped through my fingers as if deliberately escaping, as if it didn't want to be examined. When I tried to analyze it more closely, I noticed that some particles had geometric shapes, tiny, triangular, and symmetrical crystals, impossible to be formed by common natural processes. It was a pattern that reminded me of ancient drawings I had seen months before, in manuscripts linked to Paimon. But now I knew this had no relation to Paimon. This dust had another purpose, another owner. At night, the floorboards creaked in a new way. Not like old wood, but as if something heavy were pressing against them, shifting its weight at irregular intervals. The sound always came after absolute silence, as if the house held its breath before issuing that warning. I started leaving the living room light on to try and control the discomfort, but that only made it worse. With the light on, I could see the dust moving. Not much, just enough to seem like it was rearranging itself, following a pattern I didn't understand. Sometimes, it accumulated in straight lines, broken by small angles. Other times, it formed incomplete circles near the bedroom door. And then, one dawn, I found what I feared. 2 marks on the floor, as if someone, or something, had stepped there. They weren't feet. They were deep, elongated marks, pointed at the front. They looked like hooves, but not like those of a common animal. They were wider, denser, as if supporting a body too heavy to exist inside an apartment. When I touched one of the marks, the dust inside it was hot. Not warm. Hot. As if it had been left there just moments before. At that moment, for the first time, I felt something very clearly. Whatever was entering my house wasn't coming from the door. It was coming from somewhere else. From a dry, ancient, and very, very distant place. If you're already feeling the tension in this story, take a second to subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss the next dark story. These reports are always unique, and every video is edited separately to capture the exact atmosphere of each case. The first time I heard his voice, I thought it was a memory. The mind is cruel when you spend too much time alone. I was sitting at the kitchen table, staring at a glass of water I had no desire to drink, when I heard, very low, almost like a thought that gained volume, "You're hearing it too, aren't you?" I froze. The sentence didn't come from outside. It didn't come from the window, nor the hallway, nor the turned-off television. It came from a strange place, as if it had been spoken inside my head, but with a detail that made my stomach turn cold. The voice was Daniel's. It wasn't similar. It was exactly the same. The same intonation, the same breath between words, the same tired weight of someone who has seen more than they wished. I would recognize that voice even if I were surrounded by people. But I wasn't. I was completely alone. For a few seconds, I wanted to believe it was just auditory memory, some echo of old interviews I had listened to too many times while assembling his material. But this time, the phrase didn't come from any archive. It wasn't a clip from a recording. It was something new, a question directed at me. "You're hearing it too, aren't you?" This time, the voice repeated the phrase a little clearer. And then, immediately after, another voice joined from underneath. Grave, slow, deep, as if someone were trying to use Daniel's voice as a mask, testing the fit, adjusting the timbre. The two voices blended for an instant, and I had a strange sensation of multiplicity, as if more than one person were speaking at the same time, within a very small space. Inside me, I stood up impulsively, knocking over the chair. The glass fell and shattered on the floor, but the sound of the glass didn't muffle what came next. "He heard it too. You know that." This time, Daniel's voice sounded again, but with a subtle detail. The cadence of the words was wrong. It was him, but at the same time, it wasn't. As if someone were perfectly imitating what his voice once was, without fully understanding what it is to be human. I spent the rest of the night hunting for rational explanations. I opened files, re-listened to interviews, tried to find that exact phrase in some old recording. I found nothing. The phrase didn't exist anywhere, only in my house, only in my head, only that dawn. And I knew, from all I had researched, that this was a recognizable pattern. In the oldest demonological texts, those that are almost never translated, there are accounts of entities that use the vocal memory of the dead or absent to approach new victims. Orobas, in some manuscripts, is described as one who speaks what is true, but not always from his own mouth. That night, one thing became clear. Either Daniel was trying to speak to me from somewhere, or something was using his voice as a gateway. And honestly, I didn't know which option scared me more. And tell me down in the comments, what would scare you more here? Daniel really trying to speak from somewhere beyond, or something using his voice as a gateway? I really want to know what you think. After the second dawn, listening to my own house repeat Daniel's voice like a distorted echo, I realized I could no longer ignore the direction things were taking. I sat on the living room floor, surrounded by books and old notes, and began researching everything I could find about entities associated with sand, hooves, and the manipulation of truth. It didn't take long to arrive at a name that, until then, I had only seen mentioned in passing in the most obscure texts of the Ars Goetia: Orobas. The name wasn't new, but the depth of what I found was. In common texts, those that appear on websites and superficial compendiums, Orobas is described as a prince of hell who appears in the form of a black horse, sometimes later transforming into a man. But in the oldest manuscripts, especially in the pre-Renaissance versions of the Pseudo-Monarchia Daemonum, and in marginal notes by monks who never wanted to be known, the details are different. Very different. Orobas is not simply a horse. This image is incomplete, almost childish. The horse form would be merely a first manifestation, a way to announce presence without revealing intention. In human form, however, he is described as something more complex. A judge, a weigher of destinies. A spirit that does not deceive, but that rearranges the truth until it destroys from within. In texts from 1577, I found a draft that chilled me. Orobas does not seduce, he reveals. He takes what man fears to confess and transforms it into an inevitable path. Another, more fragmented manuscript spoke of disappearances associated with him. Those who see him get lost in their own versions. That sentence left me still for long minutes. They get lost in their own versions. Not in dreams, not in illusions, in versions. I later discovered that, in two 19th century investigations involving occult sects, Orobas was associated with the phenomenon of contradictory testimonies, where several people swore they had seen the same person in different locations at the same time. Each description was plausible, coherent, real, but all were impossible together. Orobas does not create illusions. He creates conflicting possibilities, parallel lives, alternative paths that collide until they destroy their originator. As I read these descriptions, I felt something very strange. The dust on the floor seemed to be vibrating, not physically, but as if the presence of that name was enough to activate something inside the house, and inside me. The more I read, the more certain I was that Daniel hadn't simply disappeared. He had been redirected, pushed somewhere between possible versions of himself, and a terrible feeling began to form. If Orobas was involved now, my fate wouldn't be like Daniel's. It would be worse, because Orobas doesn't take people, he unravels them. If this story is pulling you in, don't forget to leave your like. It really helps the channel a lot. And if you enjoy immersive dark stories like this, subscribe and stay with us, because there are many more disturbing cases ahead. The first time I truly saw something, it wasn't in the mirror, it was in the water. I had just washed my face. The early morning was so silent that I could hear my own blood circulating in my ears. The bathroom light was dim, yellowish. I left the glass on the sink, still half full, and turned to grab the towel. When I looked back at the glass, there was a face inside the water. It wasn't my reflection. It didn't match the angle, nor the position. It was as if it were looking at me from inside the liquid, and not through it. The face was narrow, too pale, the eyes large and dark, too large to be human, but not in a monstrous way. It was a subtle, millimeter-precise exaggeration, one of those you perceive first with your bones, and only then with your eyes. The skull seemed slightly elongated, as ancient illustrations described. A detail impossible to ignore, but what paralyzed me was the stillness. The figure didn't blink. It didn't breathe. Nor did it ripple with the water. It merely observed me, as if studying my every small reaction. I blinked. The image didn't disappear. On the contrary, it seemed to tilt its head a millimeter, an almost imperceptible approach, as if it understood that I had finally perceived its presence. When I finally managed to move my hand to touch the glass, the water's surface reacted before I made contact. Small ripples formed, but not from where my hand was approaching. They came from the center, as if something inside the glass had exhaled or adjusted itself. I took a step back, and then looked at the mirror. Behind me, projected in the steam still clinging to the glass, there was an enormous shadow. Not human. The silhouette seemed to be that of a large animal, a horse, but motionless, solid, silent as stone. I turned my eyes back to the glass. The water was completely still. No face, no distortion, as if nothing had happened. But in the mirror, the shadow remained there, and for an instant I had the impression that it was breathing. I had already seen the shadow in the steam, and that face submerged in the glass still haunted me when I closed my eyes. But nothing, absolutely nothing, prepared me for what happened the following dawn. I woke up to such absolute silence that it didn't seem normal. It wasn't the usual silence of an apartment at 3 in the morning. It was that kind of silence that makes the heart skip a beat, as if the body were trying to fill the absence of sound with longer beats. And it was in this silence that I heard what seemed to be breathing. Not human. Heavy. Slow. Deep. I was lying on my side, facing the wall. Something inside me told me not to turn, but the instinct for survival, or perhaps desperate lucidity, forced me to slowly turn my head. And that's when I saw it. In the corner of the room, near the window, there was a horse. Standing. Motionless. Impossibly quiet. It wasn't large like a common horse. It was too thin, almost emaciated. Its coat so dark that it absorbed the room's scant light. Its mane fell like wet, thick, heavy strands, covering part of its neck. But what truly destroyed me inside were its eyes. They were human, not in the literal sense. It wasn't a human face, but the way they stared at me, straight, deep, conscious, was so deliberate that it seemed like my every thought was being read, weighed, measured. I sat up slowly, as if any sudden movement might make it advance. The horse didn't stir, not a millimeter, no muscle contraction, no vibration in the air. It was as if it had no weight, as if it had been placed there by the will of something that didn't obey the rules of the physical world. And then I noticed something else. The air around it was dry, like desert air. The fine dust that had been appearing in the house accumulated around its hooves. 2 perfect mounds, as if the floor had been swept away from its presence. The hooves were wide, wider than any real horse, and they had a strange shape, slightly elongated at the front, as the ancient drawings described. But the most disturbing thing was that they cast no shadow. The light from the window crossed the floor and passed through it, as if the body absorbed the light instead of blocking it. I didn't know if it was breathing. In all the minutes I spent watching, I didn't see its chest rise a single time. The room smelled of dust and heat, of burnt earth, of something that didn't belong indoors. When I finally managed to blink, the figure disappeared, vanished, without sound, without movement, without transition. All that remained was the dust accumulated in 2 perfect circles on the floor, as if it had been pushed out by the presence of an invisible body. And in the center of these circles, shallow, long marks, like scratches left by hooves that never touched the ground. I wiped the dust with a trembling hand. It was hot. Hot as if it had been left there by something living just seconds before. That night, I realized something important. The horse wasn't trying to scare me. It was studying me. Orobas doesn't invade, he evaluates. And after that dawn, I was never able to be completely alone in my own house again. After that dawn of the silent horse, I spent days trying not to go crazy. I clung to what anyone would cling to. Routine, simple tasks, quick calls. Things that would still confirm that the world followed a straight line. But that's exactly when everything started to twist. Not with shadows, not with slamming doors, but with something far more dangerous. The memories of others. The first crack came in a trivial conversation. An acquaintance messaged me asking if I had gotten home safely the night before. I replied yes, but that she might be mistaken, because I hadn't left the house in days. She insisted that I had gone to her house, that we had talked for at least an hour, until around 11 at night. She described details, the clothes I would have been wearing, the phrases that would have come out of my mouth, the tone of my voice. None of that had happened, but she remembered it as if it were real. I ignored it, trying to attribute it to her stress, to the confusion of similar days, until an email arrived from a bank with confirmation of in-person visit to the branch. There was a time record, attendance name, desk number. According to the system, I had been there that morning, in another city. I called the branch, irritated. I explained that I hadn't left the house. On the other end of the line, the attendant assured me he remembered me. He described my appearance, my calm demeanor, the questions I asked about transferring and closing an account. His voice didn't seem to lie. He seemed confused because I was denying something that, in his mind, had happened exactly as recorded. From then on, the episodes multiplied. A neighbor claimed she saw me leave with a suitcase. A taxi driver swore he took me to an industrial area in the early morning. A distant colleague messaged asking if everything was okay. After the heavy conversation we had at a bar I had never set foot in. In all the accounts, I was me, acting naturally, talking about things that genuinely worried me. But in places and at times when I knew, with absolute certainty, that I was locked inside my house, desperately trying to maintain control. I started to notice a pattern. All these versions of me were always making decisions that I had been postponing in real life. Closing an account, breaking a bond, saying something I had been swallowing for months. It was as if someone was taking my intentions and materializing them into alternative versions of myself. In the descriptions, I never seemed possessed, never seemed out of my mind. On the contrary, people said I was more focused, more decisive, more firm. As if that version was the definitive form of who I should be. That's when I remembered a phrase I had read in the texts about Orobas. He does not create lies. He creates paths where they become truth. It wasn't just haunting. It was reality engineering. And a terrible idea began to grow. Somewhere, perhaps there was a version of me that believed, with full conviction, that I was the distortion. It happened on a Tuesday. Just an ordinary Tuesday. One of those where nothing seems special. I woke up with the strange sensation that I had slept too heavily, as if something had shut me down for a few hours. The light entered through the window with an opaque, almost gray glow, and the air was drier than on other days, so dry that I felt my nose burn when I breathed. I got up to open the window, expecting to hear the usual noises. Cars passing, distant conversations, engines, footsteps in the hallway. But when I pushed the glass, the world was mute. Not silent. Mute. There were no cars. There was no wind. There were no birds. No urban sound, not even that low, constant city hum that you never notice until it's gone. It was as if someone had put the universe on mute mode. I stood still for long seconds, trying to find any noise, any sign of movement. Nothing. The city looked like an abandoned set, a static photograph. Even the lights seemed suspended in the air, without vibration, without heat. It was as if time had been pulled from me. I decided to go down to the street. I put on a jacket, went down the stairs slowly, each step echoing in an exaggerated, almost artificial way. When I opened the building door, I felt a hot, dry wind. Too hot for that time of morning. The kind of heat that doesn't match urban climate. The kind of heat that belongs to deserts. The street was empty. Completely empty. I didn't see a car passing, nor people leaving for work, nor bicycles, nor the bar at the end of the street preparing to open. Everything was still, as if someone had erased the city and left only its shell. Then, as I took a few more steps outside, I heard for the first time what would change everything. The sound of hooves. It wasn't loud, nor fast. It was precise, rhythmic, almost meditative. It seemed to come from very far away, but at the same time, there was no echo, no reverberation. As if the hooves were striking a ground that didn't belong to that street. I stood completely still, trying to identify the direction. But the sound came from all sides, and from nowhere at the same time. One detail chilled me deeply. With each beat of the hooves, the dark dust that had been appearing in my house seemed to move on its own on the asphalt, being dragged by a wind I didn't feel on my face. It was as if that dust responded to the sound. I took a few steps back. My entire body began to react in a strange way. The hairs on my arms stood on end, my heart beating irregularly, as if my body recognized something my mind was still trying to deny. It was the same sensation I felt days before, when I saw the silent horse in the room. But now, it was as if that thing was outside, walking through a city that shouldn't be empty. My phone vibrated in my pocket. When I took it out, I saw that it had no signal at all. No Wi-Fi, no network, no updated time. 4:44 flashed on the screen, as if it were a warning. Then, in an automatic gesture, I touched the screen to wake it up again. The time was different, still 4:44, but the internal timer wasn't advancing. It was as if time had been frozen. I looked around. The street remained empty. The city remained mute. Only the dust, always the dust, moved in small whirlwinds, spinning in circles, as if drawing something on the ground. I spent a few minutes observing, trying to understand, and that's when I noticed a pattern. The dust formed something like a semicircle, but it wasn't a common semicircle. It looked like a footprint, a hoof print, exactly the kind I had seen inside my house. And there, in that instant, I understood that the city wasn't empty because people had disappeared. The city was empty for me, as if someone or something was erasing the world around me, leaving only what was necessary for me to understand the message. The hooves sounded once more, strong, deep, almost inside my chest. and then the silence returned. I knew, without a shadow of a doubt, that Orobas was close. Very close. And that he didn't need to appear to be real. He only needed to leave me alone with his truth. Up to this point, what do you think is really happening here? Is this a haunting, a distortion of reality, or something even worse? Leave your theory in the comments. I love seeing how each person interprets stories like this. After that day when the city fell silent, I stopped trying to convince myself that it was just a case of stress or an anxiety attack. It wasn't. And deep down, I already knew that. There was an intention behind the events. It wasn't chaos. It was method. It began with whispers I couldn't locate. They didn't come from the street, nor from neighboring apartments, nor from some forgotten electronic device left on. They were low-volume voices, as if a conversation were happening in an adjacent room. Except my house didn't have adjacent rooms. It was a simple apartment, 3 rooms, no false walls. Still, the voices were there. I didn't understand the words at first. They sounded like languages I had seen written in medieval manuscripts, but had never heard pronounced. A mix of deformed Latin with something older, drier, full of harsh syllables and strange pauses. As the days passed, one thing became clear. The voices weren't arguing among themselves. They were arguing about me. I didn't understand the exact content, but I could recognize a pattern that one only learns to identify after participating in many meetings, interrogations, or confessions. The rhythm of someone who evaluates, who weighs, who decides another person's fate. It was a judgment. Every now and then, a word would emerge clearly, as if someone brought their mouth close to my ear. Decision, omission, guilt. At times I clearly heard my name, pronounced in a cold, almost clinical manner. There was no hatred in those voices. And in a way, that was worse. Hatred is human. That was something else. One detail caught my attention. None of those voices sounded like Paimon or Astaroth, according to the descriptions I had studied. There was no theatricality, no imposition. There was something far more dangerous: detachment. The same kind of tone a judge uses when reading a sentence they didn't write, only fulfill. In one of the accounts attributed to Orobas, an anonymous monk wrote, around 1620, "He does not come to torment the senses, but to weigh the entire line of life. No lie is created by him, only placed in its proper position." Reading that after hearing those voices was like fitting the last piece of a puzzle I didn't want to see completed. What I was hearing wasn't random haunting, it was a process. I started to notice that whenever I remembered a bad decision, an error I had swept under the rug, the voices became more present. They didn't increase in volume. It's as if they became more focused, more aligned. As if that specific thought had been selected and placed on an invisible table to be analyzed. There were nights when I clearly felt I was being watched without being seen. It wasn't that generic sense of paranoia anyone feels. It was specific. It was like being in front of someone who didn't need to ask anything, because they already knew the answers, and who only observed how you reacted to them. Things got worse when, one day, the voices stopped speaking in ancient languages and started speaking in something I understood. They weren't complete sentences. They were fragments. You knew. You chose. You let it happen. I didn't know exactly which moment in my life each accusation referred to, but a feeling began to gnaw at me. It was as if every mistake I had made was being brought back, not to haunt me, but to be organized. Orobas, in the accounts I found, is rarely described as putting on supernatural shows. He doesn't levitate objects, doesn't break windows, doesn't throw people against walls. He acts where it hurts most, in the conscience. He reorganizes a person's history until they can no longer recognize themselves. There, sitting on the living room floor, listening to those voices recite loose parts of my own life, I understood one thing I didn't want to admit. I wasn't just being haunted. I was being read. And somewhere I couldn't see, my case was being decided. The morning after the silent judgment, or what I interpreted as judgment, I woke up with a strange sensation of having slept somewhere else. My body felt heavy, as if I had spent the night walking. But when I opened my eyes, I noticed there was something wrong with the air. Something almost too organized. The apartment, previously chaotic with fear, seemed deliberately tidied. Not by me, nor by someone trying to help. It was the kind of order that resembles a laboratory, each object positioned with millimeter precision, as if marking something, delineating a path. The living room floor was covered by a thin layer of dust, which I had never seen before. It was as if it had sprouted from nowhere, silent, uniform. And in the middle of that dust, there was a detail that made my stomach sink. A trail. A continuous line, traversed by something that didn't seem human. It wasn't a shoe print, nor drag marks. The mark was narrow, winding, almost like the trail of a long-legged animal or someone walking on tiptoes, but without enough weight to truly sink the dust. I followed the path with my eyes. It started exactly next to my bed. That is, that thing, whatever it was, had been standing beside me while I slept. Then, the trail led to the hallway, went around the kitchen, crossed the living room, and ended in front of the door leading to the small storage room where I kept old things. The door was ajar. I didn't remember leaving it open. In fact, I almost never went in there. The storage room was small, stuffy, full of boxes, old books, and what was left from my move when I came to that apartment years ago. But now, there was something on the door, a mark that hadn't been there before. It wasn't a drawing, it wasn't a scratch. It was as if someone had dragged a fingernail across the wood, slowly tracing a simple symbol, a circle cut by a vertical line. One of the symbols attributed to Orobas in medieval manuscripts, not as an invocation, but as a presence. In 17th century texts, this symbol appears when the demon is not being called, but when it is already circling around the original invoker. Except I hadn't invoked anything. Not directly, at least. I took a deep breath and pushed open the storage room door. The air inside felt colder than the rest of the house. There were no windows there. No reason for a different temperature, but the sensation was clear. I was being led to that place. Not out of curiosity, but by imposition. In the center of the storage room, there was a box I didn't remember seeing before. A small, light wooden box, without a lock. The lid was just resting on top, as if someone had opened and closed it several times. I knelt down. The voices from the previous day seemed to return, but now without language, just as pressure in my head, like a buzzing condition to my every movement. And when I opened the box, I understood why the trail ended there. Inside were loose sheets, all in my handwriting. Disconnected phrases, dates I didn't remember writing. Simple drawings, circles, crosses, geometric lines, like architectural plans made by someone in a trance. But what truly destroyed me was the last sheet. At the top, written firmly, was a phrase I would never consciously write. He accepted to walk. The handwriting was perfect, the calligraphy clear. But it wasn't me. And, as if the apartment wanted to confirm, I felt a movement behind me. It wasn't wind, it wasn't a shadow, it was the dust. It moved on its own, as if something invisible had just passed behind me, completing the path that began at my bed, without noise, without haste, without hiding its presence. It was as if someone, or something, was guiding me. And that path didn't end in the storage room. It only began. The days following the discovery of the box drained my sense of time, as if the apartment had begun to consume entire hours without me noticing. It was impossible to distinguish morning, afternoon, and night within that silence that no longer seemed natural. It seemed manufactured. The clocks kept breaking. All of them, without exception. First the wall clock, then the microwave clock. Finally, my cell phone, which froze at 3:06 a.m. and refused to change for almost 10 minutes, until it restarted on its own. When the screen came back on, the device's background, which used to be a photo of me, had been changed to a completely black image. Then, the sounds emerged. Not normal sounds. Not wood creaks or water pipes. But short, rhythmic vibrations, always too distant to identify, yet close enough to wake my body before my mind. I would get up without understanding what was waking me. I felt several times as if a glass was vibrating on the table, even when nothing was moving before my eyes. But that wasn't the worst of it. The worst was when the apartment started to respond. One night, I sat on the couch and said in a low voice, "Enough. I want this to stop." Something cracked in the wall behind me. Not like wood settling, but like a response. A single sound, precise, dry. As if the building had said, "No." From then on, the feeling of being watched ceased to be paranoia. It became routine. I felt the air change when I turned my back, as if someone was very close, sharing the same space, with no intention of hiding. And then came the mirrors. The first was the bathroom mirror. I quickly passed in front of it, and for a second, my reflection remained still, motionless, facing me, even when I was already 2 meters away. The second was the reflection in the turned-off television. There, I didn't see a delayed reflection. I saw something behind me, tall, static, like a man hidden in the gloom of the hallway. Except when I turned, there was nothing. The third manifestation was definitive. I woke up on the couch without remembering having slept there. The television was on, but without sound. A blue screen with white text that trembled slightly, as if being typed at that very moment. "You are not falling. You are descending." The message disappeared in less than half a second. Too fast to be captured by my phone. But I knew what I had seen. And it wasn't a bug, a glitch, or paranoia. That was language, interaction, direct communication. And with each new day, the interference drew closer to my body. I started losing small stretches of time, lapses of seconds, then minutes. I was in the hallway, and, in a blink, I was already in the kitchen. Then, in the bedroom. Always with the feeling that I had been accompanied. The voices that were once in the background now seemed to come from the center of my head. They weren't words, they were impulses, calls. A silent, invisible, yet continuous command. Follow. The signs intensified on the third night. The living room door was scratched in the morning, but not as if an animal had done it. The scratches drew perfect parallel lines, mathematically spaced. Something impossible to occur without a ruler, without measurement, without almost mechanical precision. And on the hallway floor, someone had written in the dust, "Not yet." As if something was holding back the exact moment. As if the fall was inevitable, but not immediate. As if there were stages. And then I noticed a pattern. The manifestations weren't random, nor chaotic, nor impulsive. They were preparatory, sequential, ritualistic. It was as if something was organizing my internal space so it could fit inside me. And it was working. The signs before the fall weren't warnings. They were instructions, and I was beginning, even unwillingly, to follow them. Up to that point, almost everything could be pushed aside as perception. Voices, lapses, abnormal silence, delayed reflections. It was possible, at least in theory, to blame the brain, sleep, trauma. But at some point, that ceased to be enough. There was an exact moment when the thing crossed the boundary from the psychological and entered matter. And when that happens, there's no turning back. The first sign was so discreet that I almost didn't notice it. A glass. I knew exactly where I had left it, next to the sink, on the right. Always on the right. I had that kind of habit. The next morning, it was on the left, leaning against the wall, millimeter perfectly aligned with the tile grout. That could have been my distraction. I wanted to believe that. I wanted to very much. The next day, it was the chair. I was working on the computer, got up to go to the bathroom, and when I returned, the chair was a few centimeters further back. Not enough to seem like someone had sat there, but enough that my legs hit it sooner than they should have. It made no sound. The friction was minimal, as if it had been moved too slowly to produce sound. I started taking photos of everything, of the couch, the table, the bookshelf, the bedroom door, the drawers, photos before sleeping, photos upon waking, meticulous comparisons. That's when the rational lie fell apart. In the first comparison, I noticed that one of the books on the shelf had changed position. Not only that, it had moved to a different shelf. I never did that. My books were organized by theme, a habit I'd had since I was a teenager. In the before photo, The book was on the bottom. In the after, it was on top, with two others displaced by exactly 2 finger widths. The entire scene seemed planned. As the nights passed, the displacements increased. A crooked painting, but crooked at an angle that formed a line with the edge of the door. The coffee table slightly rotated to point exactly towards the hallway. The rug with one corner lifted, forming a perfect triangle. Nothing was knocked over. Nothing was broken. Nothing was chaotic. Everything was too precise to be attributed to chance. I did a test. I placed several random objects on the living room floor. A pen, a key, a plastic cup, a book, a coin. I left them all scattered, out of any order, intending to confuse the pattern, if there was one. I photographed them, turned off all the lights, and went to the bedroom, trying to sleep. I woke up in the early morning, to that silence I knew too well. There was no sound of hooves, no voices. There was just the certainty that something had passed through there. I got up, grabbed my phone, turned on the screen, and went to the living room. The objects were no longer scattered. They were aligned, all in a row, forming a perfect straight line, pointing towards the apartment's entrance door. The key in front, then the pen, the coin, the cup, the book. The distance between each item was exactly the same. I measured with my fingers, a 2-finger gap between each item. The message was clear. It wasn't my mind. It was my space being used. I started to notice other details. The sound changed. The walls seemed to absorb noises in a different way. When I tapped my finger on the wood, the return was the same kind of sound you hear in an old, empty, unfurnished building. And yet, the house remained full. One night, sitting on the couch, I had the impression that the apartment had stretched. The hallway seemed longer. The distance to the kitchen, greater than the day before. I took a measuring tape. I measured. I wrote it down. The next morning, I measured again. The number was the same. And yet, when I walked, my body said no. That I was taking more steps. That the spatial sensation had been altered. Orobas, in ancient texts, is rarely described as someone who knocks things over. But some accounts speak of environments that become uninhabitable not through destruction, but through dissonance. Places that no longer seem to fit correctly within official measurements. A passage I found said, "Where he passes, the house ceases to be a house and becomes a crossroads." I didn't have doors opening on their own, nor windows banging. I had something worse. I had a house that, little by little, stopped responding to the most basic rules. Objects moving silently. Spaces changing sensation without changing size. Ordinary things that, reorganized, formed invisible maps. It wasn't a poltergeist. It wasn't a show to scare. It was architecture. It was preparation. Orobas wasn't just present. He was setting a stage. And, by elimination, I realized what that meant. If that was the stage, perhaps I was the play. There is a moment, in any haunting process, when fear ceases to be the worst part. The worst is lucidity. The worst is when you understand that you are not being deceived, not deluding yourself, not seeing shadows where none exist, but rather seeing too much, seeing what would have been better left unnoticed. I reached that point on an apparently ordinary morning, a day that began like all others and ended by reorganizing everything I thought I knew about reality. I woke up at 7:14 a.m. I looked at my phone, confirmed the time, got up. Nothing seemed out of place. Nothing seemed wrong. It was a cruel normality, like a scene prepared to make me drop my guard. Except something caught my attention when I passed through the living room. The feeling that the air was thick. It wasn't heat. It wasn't a smell. It was density. As if the atmosphere had gained its own weight. The light from the window entered, but seemed to pass through an invisible filter, as if the brightness lost strength before touching the objects. I sat on the couch to try and understand what I was feeling. And that's when I noticed the detail that changed everything. The rug was turned upside down. Not just displaced, flipped. The rough side facing up, the soft side facing down, as if someone had lifted the entire piece with extreme care, flipped it, and placed it back in absolute silence. This would be physically impossible without dragging furniture, without leaving marks, without making noise. I should have called someone. I should have left there. But fear makes us curious. And my curiosity has always been greater than my instinct for self-preservation. So I decided to do something that today, looking back, I understand as psychological suicide. I knelt down and lifted one of the rug's corners. The wood underneath was no longer the same. Where there should have been the normal pattern of the floorboards, there were symbols, fine symbols, engraved with geometric precision, forming lines that connected like circuits. They weren't superficial marks. They seemed carved, as if the wood had been opened and redrawn from within. I touched one of the lines. The wood was hot. When I lifted the fabric further, I saw the entire drawing. An almost perfect circle, crossed by straight lines and impossible angles, the kind you only find in forbidden manuscripts, from those sects that insist on surviving at the margins of Christianity. I recognized 2 of these symbols from ancient texts about Orobas, described in the Pseudomonarchia Daemonum as marks of passage, formations used not to invoke, but to anchor a presence. That wasn't preparation. It was installation. I recoiled instinctively. However, when I took a step back, I noticed something that made my vision darken for a second. The drawing wasn't under the rug the night before. It had been made while I slept, or while I was fading out, and fading out more and more, without realizing it. I looked at the hallway. The air seemed to vibrate there, like heat shimmering over asphalt. But the hallway was cold. It was then that the kitchen clock ticked. A tick. Just one. A single second marking alone in the house's total silence. I looked and realized the hands weren't moving. The clock wasn't on. The battery had been removed the previous week. Even so, I heard the tick. When I turned back to the rug, the marks on the wood had changed. The curved line that had once formed a semicircle was now complete. The circle closed on its own while I looked away. There was no sound, no vibration. Just the accomplished, silent, impossible fact. And the instant I understood that, I heard the first voice of the day. It came from the bedroom, low, breathed. Too close to be an echo, but too distant to be human. Daniel. The pronunciation wasn't like someone calling. It was like the sound of someone testing my name. Like someone trying out a new word, trying to decide if it fits. My entire body froze. I couldn't answer, nor move, nor think. The voice repeated, now clearer, as if my hesitation had given permission. Daniel. And then, the floor vibrated, not like a tremor, like an impact. A single impact coming from inside the circle beneath the rug, as if something had pressed against the wood from underneath, trying to rise. I understood immediately. Orobas wasn't trying to enter. He was already inside. And now he wanted out. Out of what? Out to where? Out to whom? I got the answer seconds later, when the wood made a cracking sound. A sound that shouldn't exist in a modern urban house, without a basement. A sound of a hoof scratching wood. And then I realized, that was no longer my apartment. It was a threshold, and I was trapped exactly in the middle. I don't remember how I left the apartment that morning. I don't remember locking the door, nor going down the stairs. I only remember being on the sidewalk, with trembling hands trying to breathe, while cars passed as if nothing was happening. As if the world continued normally, and I was the only one who had crossed an invisible boundary. The cruelest part is that no one noticed me. Neither my state, nor the dark dust on my clothes, nor the metallic dry smell coming from my skin. I returned hours later. I needed to confirm that everything had been real. Or perhaps I needed to pray that it hadn't been. But when I opened the apartment door, I immediately felt something was different again. The house was too clean, too organized, as if someone, or something, had erased all traces. The rug was in place, the right way up. The circle on the wood had disappeared, without marks, without carvings, without any sign of alteration. For an instant, I thought I was going crazy. That everything had been a breakdown, a hallucination, an emotional overload. But then I saw the detail that destroyed any possibility of denying the truth. The living room mirror. In recent years, it had always reflected exactly what it should. Today, it reflected too much. I was standing in the center of the room, but the reflection, my copy, was a little closer to the glass. Just a few centimeters. Subtle. Deliberate. I looked at my hands. They were still. I looked at the mirror. The reflection's hands were relaxed. Too much. Without tension. As if the body inside was comfortable where it was. Where I should be. When I took a step back, expecting the reflection to do the same, it took 1/10 of a second longer to move. It wasn't a light glitch. It wasn't distortion. It was will. My reflection hesitated. And in that micro delay, I felt a pressure behind my eyes, as if someone had placed invisible fingers inside my mind and was pushing from the inside out, searching for space, testing walls. A voice, not a whisper, but a thought that wasn't mine, formed with clarity. The door has already opened. I stumbled away from the mirror. The reflection didn't stumble. It remained still, watching. Then, slowly, very slowly, it tilted its head to the side, a movement I didn't make. That's when I understood that Orobas no longer needed the house, nor the symbols, nor the circle. He had found something better. A mobile habitat. Portable. Perfect. Me. Since then, I noticed small breaks in perception. A word I don't remember thinking appearing in the middle of a sentence. A sensation of being pushed to the back of my own mind. A lost moment in memory that returns as if it belonged to someone else. I feel like I'm sharing my body with something too ancient to comprehend. And, sometimes, waking up in the early morning, I find my own body standing, in front of the mirror, staring fixedly at the reflection, as if studying what still needs to be taken over. I try to call my name, but nothing comes out, because the voice is now his. And the last sentence I heard, before losing consciousness this morning, came exactly from my mouth. But it wasn't me who said it. Ready. The door is inside. If you stayed until the end, thank you so much, family. Seriously. If this story got under your skin, subscribe to the channel, leave your like, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss the next ones. We read all the comments, so tell me what you thought of this story. What part disturbed you the most, and where you're watching from? Your country, state, and city. I'd also love to know if you have suggestions for other real horror stories for the channel. And before you leave, watch the other videos here on the channel. Every story is unique, and each one is edited individually to capture the exact atmosphere of that report. Thank you for everything, family.